gentlemen, I must say this is a highlight for me, a personal highlight of the Ars Boni session. I'm very, very pleased and very proud to announce Ivan Krastev to you. Ivan Krastev is chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia in Bulgaria, and he is a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. This is one of the reasons why Vienna is so great, because we have, people like Krastev having in Vienna, that's really a privilege of the city. From May to December 2019, he has been awarded a Mercator Senior Fellowship, and beyond that, he is a founding board member of the European Council on Foreign Relations, a member of the Global Advisory Board of Open Society Foundations New York, and a member of the Advisory Council of the Center for European Policy Analysis at the European Cultural Foundation. And I could continue now with several similar very important positions, but I must confess that this is not the main reason why I invited him and why I'm so proud that I have the privilege to meet him now. The reason why I invited him are in particular two books that he wrote in 2019 and 2020 and that I read. And both of them were mind-opening and mind-blowing for me. The first one that was published in 2019, The Light That Failed, A Reckoning. And then in 2020, one of the very early attempts to analyze the crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, is titled, Is It Tomorrow Yet? Paradoxes of the Pandemic. That was published in 2020. The Light That Failed, The Reckoning, that I read in 2019, in my view, is the, if I may say so, is the most convincing explanation and analysis of what happened in Europe and to Europe since 1989 that I ever read. It's really, if you have not read that book yet, you need to, because it explains the situation that Europe faces in a really outstanding way. The book, however, obviously was written before the crisis, and the book ends. If I may tell this to the audience. At the beginning, for the non-readers in the audience, the book ends with two alternative endings. So it says that, and Krastev even gave an interview on this that I saw, that at the beginning they really wanted to publish this book with two different endings, but the editors seemingly did not agree with this. So it's one book having two endings therefore instead of two books. And one of them is the positive view, so that liberalism might readapt to the situation and might survive in a sense. And the other one is the pessimistic way of a further decline of the European Western liberalistic approach. And it's open, it's an open ending. So it's unclear what the outcome will be. And therefore, Ivan, if I may ask, would you still keep that ending open if you were writing the book today?
Listen, I will, because I always believe that future is the invasion of the unknown. Mm-hmm. So from this point of view, what is common between the pessimists and optimists is that they believe that they know what the future has stored for us. Mm-hmm. And I'm not so sure about this. And for us, when we started with Stephen Holmes writing the book, The Light That Failed, we had a clear idea that certain type of a period, certain political cycle has ended. But from this point of view, we were not very much sure exactly what is going to happen after this. And even this crisis with COVID-19 keep this uncertainty very much with us, because one of the interesting story, at least for me, with the pandemic is that it was not so much a disruption, but amplification of certain trends we have been seeing before. And if you're going to see, probably the outcomes are going to be very different in different places. But one thing is for clear, the world in the way it was imagined and constructed in 1989, the post-Cold War world we were talking about, have ended, and kind of the pandemic was the official ending of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that would be some kind of a last chapter that was not written yet then. which is probably not.
It should have ended with the virus, but we were not aware then, basically.
Yeah. But that's probably not the mainstream story. I think the mainstream story that is told at the moment is that this crisis, the pandemic, is a crisis that is fundamentally more serious and more fundamental than any other before. And from a lawyer's perspective, this might, at least from a European legal perspective, this might even be true, because all the limitations in our fundamental rights that we see at the moment are unique in comparison with anything that happened before since the Second World War. So at least for a typical European lawyer, I would say one must say that this is by far more intensive than anything that happened until then. And it's perhaps even structurally something different, because all the size of the problem led to all kinds of changes in the democratic system. So for example, the governments have significantly increased their power in comparison with the parliament. The communication to the media has significantly changed, because media, at the beginning at least, were just repeating what the government was saying. The constitutional courts and the lawyers were rather silent at the beginning, and so on. So one could argue, from a legal perspective, from a European legal perspective, I must say, that this is different. It would not be the last chapter of one book, but it could be also the first chapter of another one.
No, you're absolutely right. But I'm going very much to agree with you. What is interesting for me is the following. First, this is the first global crisis that we experience. It's not simply that it was over. Everywhere in the world, basically, the pandemic became the major issue, but it happened in a very short period of time. If you go and imagine that you're watching all the TV channels in the world in March, nevertheless, that you don't know probably most of the languages in the world, you will know very clearly what is going on, because there was one topic, and this was the pandemic. But my way of looking at this, and as I told you, I agree with it that it's a profound crisis. My idea is this is a profound crisis that should be interpreted as the second coming of the three previous crises that we faced in Europe in the last 20 years. Since many of the things that we talk about, the restrictions of rights, for example, all the surveillance issue, this is the second coming of the debates that started with the terrorist attacks in places like Spain and France. And it was very much, what was new was how people reacted. During kind of a terrorist crisis, the European version of 9/11, people were much more critical and much more reluctant to give the governments the right to survey, to track movements, basically to restrict rights. Of course, in the time of pandemic, people were much more tolerant, and particularly the virus tracking apps were not opposed by the majority of the population in the EU member states, because the fear was not simply that this is a threat for your health, but people were very much afraid to infect other people. So basically being responsible. If you see on the financial side, of course, this crisis is much more profound than the crisis that we have in the last 20 years, so probably any time after 1945 in Europe. But the interesting story is that it's also the second coming of the global financial crisis. If you see all the major debates, including the Corona bonds and so on, you have the feeling that we're in the same debate, but now we came to a totally different conclusion. Now European Union and European Commission, and particularly Germany, support policies that they have been strongly opposing in 2009, 2010. We went for certain neutralization of the future deaths. If you see the level of redistribution within Germany, much higher than you can imagine in 2009, 2010. And then when you talk about closing of the borders and all these issues of basically borders, in a certain way, the COVID-19 is the second coming of the refugee crisis. Because in March, for over 3 or 4 days, there were more borders being closed within the European Union than during the migration crisis. So from this point of view, I agree, but my idea is this is a crisis that amplified the crisis before, that exposed the certain things that were there before, and simply make it much more deeper and much more profound, and to be honest, much more consequential. So from this point of view, I totally agree with you, but even the change of the power between the parliament and the governments, it didn't start with pandemics. Pandemics allows us to see it, how strong this trend is. But in a certain way, one of the major strengths of the trend was also the moment the very European integration was one of the ways in which the executives are becoming stronger than the parliaments, particularly the national parliaments.
I think I agree very much with you. I think, however, let me ask whether you see a switch or a change in the perception of the crisis now in the phases in which we are at the moment, which is a second lockdown, right? So we are now in the phase that some countries, just like Austria, are now going through a second iteration of people not being allowed to leave their home, and all other kinds of reductions and limitations of their fundamental rights. Do you see, again, this as a reiteration of the same symptoms of the crisis, or has anything changed in this second cycle now?
The most interesting about this crisis is that we're in the middle of it. So it's very difficult, even when I was basically deciding should I write or not about the crisis, my feeling was it's much easier to write in the early days than in the middle of it. Because this is a crisis which, first of all, is changing a lot, and I'm going to give you some arguments about this, but the very length of the crisis is going to be critically important of its effect. For example, certain policies that were quite acceptable and worked well in March and April are going to have probably a very different political response in December, or imagine if they're going to be again in March or April next year. So where I see basically this these developments, and even when I was coming with this title, Is It Tomorrow Yet? A friend of mine emailed me a song of Bob Dylan who said, tomorrow is a long time. And tomorrow is really a long time. And one of the interesting story about the first lockdown was that, and this is why so different governments, is different parts of the world, different political system, different societies were doing the same thing, was it was a moment of high uncertainty. We have a virus. We didn't know much about it. We don't know how it was spreading. We don't know how to cure it. So in the moment like this, in the moment of high uncertainty, there are two things that you're doing. First, you're working with the worst case scenario, exactly because you don't know. And secondly, what is quite interesting, particularly if you're democratic governments, you're trying to do what others are doing, because not knowing what to do, you don't want to be accused tomorrow that you didn't do what your neighbors did. This is why I was quite always impressed by Sweden, not because I agree that they were right or wrong during this debate of how to respond, but because the very way to do something different than anybody else in the European Union, this kind of dissenting position was a highly risky one. Because most of the other governments, even when they're saying why you're doing this, why you're locking down, they're going to say, look what our neighbors are doing. They're doing the same. So from this point of view, I do believe in March and April, everything was about uncertainty. But politics is about translating uncertainty into risks. And it is about managing risks. And this is why I do believe that now the population on one level is kind of exhausted and tired of being locked down, of this level of uncertainty, but also they start to ask the government, what do you learn from the crisis? Why do you believe that something that worked in March or April should be repeated now? And this is across the board. And I do believe it's politically the reaction is going to be much more different than it was during the first weeks, when basically the lockdown strengthened the position of the governments. Now they can weaken them.
Yeah, and when we talk about Sweden, I mean, one of the explanations that I read about Sweden was that in Sweden the approach was different because the experts were the one leading the response. So it was an expert's opinion then steering the government's reactions, whereas in many other European countries it was the government setting the political agenda and listening or not listening to the experts, right? So there were clearly differences in how important experts are and which experts were part of the political game, but it was a political decision in most of the countries. And in Sweden, at least this is the argument, it was an expert's position. How would you assess the role of experts in this debate in Europe at the moment? And is there anything that we can learn from what they are doing or not doing on the importance of intellectuals on the political in the political framework at the moment?
Yeah, this is a great question, because particularly in the beginning of the crisis, I was one of those that was convinced that unlike the global financial crisis or the migration crisis, where the experts' view have been highly mistrusted by the general public, this was one of the crises in which you can at least expect the restoration of a trust in the expertise, because this is about people, about their own public health. And in the beginning, we had the feeling that people and also governments are much more ready to listen to the experts than ever before. But then in the late May, European Council on Foreign Relations did a public opinion survey trying to see how the trust of experts is varying in different EU member states. And of course, there are differences. Countries like Germany, for example, or Denmark, the trust in the experts is much higher than in places like Italy or France. But one of the interesting stories is that we ended up with a three group of people when it comes to the experts and expertise. One is, and this is quite interesting, almost 1/3 of the European publics who remains very mistrustful to the experts. They're buying any type of a conspiracy theories that are going to come to you. And the reason they don't trust science and experts is that experts disagree between themselves. And in some countries, we're talking about a very high profile experts who disagree. A Nobel Prize winner disagreeing with a Nobel Prize winner in the case of France. And we can easily argue that this is how science works. There is a science because scientists disagree. But for many ordinary people, the fact that there was no one common expert opinion is a reason enough not to trust anybody. The second group trusted experts and science, but the third group is very interesting, and this touches very much on what you are saying. This is people who in general trust expertise, but they do believe that governments are simply selecting the experts that are going to justify the position that they have taken already and allowing the experts to influence their positions. And this third group is particularly powerful in countries in which the COVID-19 response was highly politicized and in the countries in which societies are politically polarized. For example, Poland is such a country in which almost 1/3 of the people said, yes, in general, we trust experts and science, but we don't trust them now because this is the government that is selecting the experts and not the way that experts are influencing the government.
One of the typical answers to this was, in my view, that people asked for more transparency, how those experts are selected and what their background is and what their interest is. When I prepared for this talk, I saw a TED presentation that you gave in 2012, I think, that's on the internet, where you were very critical about the idea that transparency is a good idea in the political process, I would say, because at least in my reading, because one of the arguments that you said there is transparency is one of the best instruments for the people in power to silence those who are not, right? You even quote, I think, a president there saying that this is the best instrument to silence my ministers if everyone can read on the next day what they are saying. So is transparency then in this expert dilemma something different from the political process, or would you insist that also there this issue that where there is a lot of light, there is a lot of shadow applies?
No, listen, my major argument was, and this still I very strongly believe it, that transparency can be an important instrument for policy. Transparency cannot be the goal of a policy. You can be very transparent and at the same time come with very wrong decisions. Transparency is not going to predetermine the quality of the decisions. Some of the major dictatorial decisions were incredibly transparent. Basically trying to destroy certain ethnic groups and others, it was not put in hidden. So what was interesting, of course, is the conflict of interests. People are very sensitive on this for very good reasons, because there is this kind of a fear that in the moment of crisis, many companies basically see an opportunity to make an incredibly big money. But I do believe we're talking about something which is much more deeper in the way the modern world functions. We have experts with different expertise. They are people who basically are experts on the spread of disease. There are different type of medical fields in which you're expert. And as a result of it, you're seeing the crisis very differently. And then paradoxically, where is the political side of the expertise? The political side of the expertise is to try to identify what is the real risk for society. And from this point of view, the biggest risk from political point of view is the collapse of the public health system, which is not simply going to increase the number of people suffering and dying, but this is going to be the crisis of the legitimacy of the state as such. Listen, in Bulgaria now, in the last week, we are seeing several cases in which patients are moved from hospital to hospital, and there is not a hospital that is ready to basically treat them and to get them there, because all beds are full and basically there is no capacity for this. This type of a crisis is the crisis that the government should prevent at any cost, because if people cannot rely on the public health system, this is a crisis which goes much more beyond the health of one or the other person. So from this point of view, it is quite interesting to see how the decisions are taken. For example, one of the interesting story about Sweden was that not simply that the certain type of experts took the decision, and according to their legislation, this decision is not taken by the government, but by independent agency. But this independent agency took into the account the fact that, for example, density of people living in the same apartment, things like this. It is also very much understanding the society in which you live, high level of responsibility. And from this point of view, one of the most interesting things, and I'll finish on this, which I figured out, is that the countries that are doing relatively well in Europe, but particularly outside of Europe, I mean, countries like Singapore started now better, but South Korea, Taiwan, which was very, very successful. It's a countries, China is a slightly different case because of a kind of the nature of the response that they have. But what is important about the Asian countries, they have an experience with a similar crisis for the last 20 years. Because of SARS, they were better prepared because they knew how to respond. They knew how their public responds. They knew how public health system responds. And I do believe this is critically important. And from this point of view, to say the experts take the decision, the experts can take the decision how to treat the COVID-19. But the political risk of how many people are basically closing and destroy the public health system, at the end of the day, is a political decision, and the politicians should be responsible for it.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me that you quote Taiwan here, and also Singapore and Hong Kong, because both of those were very successful in the sense that there are more or less no cases there.
Yeah.
So it's not that the public health system is fighting against the stress. There is no stress because there's nobody sick. Whereas the paradigm that we have in Europe is the one that you referred to, which is we need to avoid under all circumstances that there are too many patients for the intensive care units. That's a different goal, I would say. It's not the same thing. And I would like to ask you, or I would like to repeat that the sentence that you said before, that politics is a transformation, transforming uncertainty into risk, is exactly what we see at the moment in Europe, right? Because it's not transforming uncertainty into let the disease be completely extinct, but it's let the disease be present in a sense that we can still tolerate because the intensive care units will make it, right? Yeah. And that looks like a different approach than the Asian one. Wouldn't you agree on?
No, I'll agree. But the story is that the Asians succeeded to basically, in a certain way, avoid high number of infections, exactly because in the previous crisis, they went to a situation in which quite a lot of people have died. So strangely enough, if you see on the level of the legislation, they have a special legislation coming from 2012, South Koreans.
Yeah.
For example, if you see on the level of the surveillance and all these virus tracking apps and others, this is the legacy of 2012 crisis. And by the way, they're surveying as aggressively and brutally as the Chinese do. So from this point of view, it's quite interesting to see, and because South Korea is a democratic country, China is not. One of the interesting stories for me was to what extent the border between democracies and non-democracies on certain level have been blurred as a result of this crisis. But you're totally right in one thing, that it's very important to know what is the problem that the government is trying to solve. One is basically to prevent the spread of the disease. In a certain way, I do believe Europe lost this already in February. And one of the reasons was that we were totally unprepared. Now the story is how basically to keep the society dealing with this, decreasing the number of people dying and going to the intensive cares, but also the economic part of it should not be underestimated. Trying to keep economy moving as much as possible. Because now I do believe also on the level of society what starts to change is that if in March and April people were totally preoccupied with their health, now many of them look around and said, what's going to happen to my job? Is there going to be enough money? What is going to happen to my business? Is it now that countries that are doing better with the pandemics are going to replace us on the market? And I do believe this is making the calculation much more difficult than it was in March and April.
Yeah, about the blurring between democracies and non-democracies, just a spontaneous remark. The Austrian Chancellor even tweeted that whatever we need to do needs to be done, because no matter whether it's a democracy or I think he said something like authoritarian regime, these are the rules that need to be followed. So there is an explicit statement even of the as I said, the Chancellor. But I would also like to know now from you, is this change in the perception so that it's no longer just a disease, but that the economic part of it is also coming into the game and into the calculation? Is this something that is driven by the people understanding better the implications of the whole pandemic, or is it driven by the political class now taking more into consideration how the country they are responsible for competes with others, or is it a better understanding of the environment in which we are that drives this development?
I do believe it's a mixture of all of them. So on one level, of course, the government tried to imagine how much money are going to be needed basically to keep economy surviving in these conditions. And as I told you, the biggest question is how long it can take. And this is a very interesting question, because strangely enough, in March and April, there are still people who believe that we're going to be fine during the summer. In the autumn, we're going to be back to the normal. And now for the first time, people start to say, what about 2 years, 3 years? Even the vaccine, which is of course very much moving the markets, is quite interesting because, listen, the emergence and the existence of the vaccine is not the end of the crisis. This is the critical mass of vaccinated people that is the end of the crisis. And particularly in many of the Western and non-Western countries, there is a strong opposition to vaccines in general or to this particular vaccine. Also, there is a huge question, who is going to be vaccinated when? And for me, one of the interesting stories is that if you see this crisis, the groups who are most vulnerable to the public health dimension of the crisis and to the economic dimension of the crisis are not the same group. For example, if you're an older person, of course, the threat that you're going to be infected and as a result of it, you're going to end up in the intensive care or dying is much higher than if you're a younger person. On the other side, if you're a younger person who just graduated university, the chance that you're not going to find a job if this continues for a year or two is becoming higher and higher. And one of the interesting story about this crisis is that because of this type of asymmetries, it is starting to change the perceptions. In the first wave of the crisis, the level of solidarity, people caring for each other, in my view, was a spontaneous response to this crisis. And now starts to come the question, who is losing, who is benefiting? And of course, we talk a lot about staying at home is an option for whom and for whom it is not an option. And this is interesting. Also, the economic preoccupation can be seen in the fact that if in the first wave, the instinctive reaction of the government was to close the borders. And by the way, the Austrian government was very vocal on this. Now, if you see with the second wave, you can basically insist of people not leaving their houses, but at the same time, nobody's pushing for closing the borders, because understanding that from the economic point of view, this is going to be extremely destructive. Because there are certain things that we learned from the first wave of the crisis, and one of them is how economically interdependent Europeans are. And this is quite interesting, and this is what governments learned, and also, by the way, what businesses learned.
Yeah, that in a way is you can see this as a very positive story in the sense that Europe is getting a much better or a much better perception at the moment than it got in March and April, because that was really striking then, that one of the very first reactions of the Austrian government and many of the others in Europe was simply shutting down everything and going back to a very old nationalistic political approach, right? So we don't care about our neighbors, it's just us that we need to take care of. And that is different in this phase now.
It is different, and for me this is interesting because even this was there was this nationalistic instinct immediately. Strangely enough, historically, this is not new. Normally, closing of the borders was one of the initial reactions of the government starting with the 17th century. How they react to the crisis, because in the moment of the pandemics, the most important is to know who is in and who is out, who is moving from where to where, and the very idea of the passport, as we know, is very much connected to the plagues and to the other movement of people. But what was interesting is that something that even on this first stage, this type of a nationalist reaction was slightly different than the one that we saw during the migration crisis. Because it was nationalism based not origin but on residence. It was quite interesting to see that, for example, many countries, people were very much trying to include the foreigners that are living in the countries during the pandemics, because you cannot leave them on their own, because basically they're going to get infected, they're going to infect others. At the same time, after the first 2 or 3 weeks in which you try to get your own come back, if your own decided to stay out of the country, the government is saying it was your choice. Don't bother me. And also it was interesting to see this kind of a local, regional kind of a nationalism that emerged. In France, there was a major revolt against basically the people coming from Paris and other urban centers to their second houses, to their summer houses, saying, listen, what? You're coming to infect us? So this was an interesting story. And then comes what you're pointing out. What we learned from the first crisis is that this type of a closing of the borders is economically suicidal. Suddenly, particularly for countries like Austria, you realize to what extent the Austrian economy is dependent not simply on foreigners in the country, but people who are crossing borders on the daily basis. And I do believe this changed the perception, and paradoxically, a crisis that started as a kind of a crisis very much defined by the nationalistic instinct, it ended as a crisis that basically convinced the government that economic nationalism does not have, simply cannot function in the current state of European economies.
Several remarks. First one, we had very similar stories like in France, also in Austria. So people in Burgenland, which is 50 kilometers away from Vienna, asking that Viennese should not come because they are bringing the disease. So that's really completely absurd, because it's 50 kilometers and it's culturally absolutely the same thing, obviously. So it's simply fear of getting infected. Second, there is a debate in Austria about in how far this nationalism is to be understood in the sense that we are talking about people having a specific passport, or whether it's about people living in a certain territory. And that debate was interesting to see, because some of the far right and conservative politicians insisted on, we are talking about Austrians here and not about people who are residents. And the third remark, that now about the borders and how borders become a little bit absurd. One of the funny stories in this country is that now in this lockdown, we learn that if you are not allowed to work in your office, but you are allowed to work from home, please do so, but be sure that your that your home is within the Austrian borders. So you may work remotely, but only if it's inside the country. And there are social security rules or labor law rules, or both of them, leading into this situation. But I think that people who are affected by this do not really tolerate that very well, right? So
no, it's very interesting, because the moment when you say people stay home, you're basically pushing people to decide where is home.
Indeed.
And the home could be only on one place. And it was interesting because this pushed, by the way, a huge movement of people. Around 200,000 Bulgarians came back to the country in the first round of the pandemics, because most of these people are basically labor migrants, which are living in an apartment with 5-6 other persons, who basically are paid on some of time, even on a weekly basis. So for them, the places where they have been working was not home. But on the other side, the very idea that you should have one place and one home was this incredibly interesting story that you're talking also about Austria and Paris. The idea is, if you're from Paris, stay in Paris. I was very much interested how the idea of mobility suddenly started to be perceived as a threat. Suddenly people start asking the questions. On one level, during the summer, you're going to see people saying, I'm ready to take the risk, but I want to go somewhere, because for me not moving is the best kind of a signal that I'm losing my freedom. The mobility, and by the way, this particularly strong on Eastern Europe, where for us, in a certain way, crossing the borders, mobility was the strongest experience that we get after the end of the Cold War. And on the other side, this kind of idea that immobile people are the only people that fit for the COVID-19 world. And this is quite interesting for me.
Yeah, and indeed, and it's very, I mean, again, in the second wave now, this is a success factor, or something where you measure in how far the politics are successful, in how far they manage to reduce the mobility, and it's surveyed by tracing and tracking the mobile phones of the population, arguing that this is not really a legal problem because everything is anonymous, right? So the story that is told is, let us track whether people stay at home by using their mobile data, and we are allowed to do so because it's not about their personality rights, and it's not about their personal right to data protection, because we do this only anonymously. So that, of course,
you absolutely, and I can imagine that you had this discussion, knowing the profile of the conversation that you had. But this is critically important, because it's the problem: what do you govern? Being a government.
Yeah. So what do you govern?
And from this point of view, this is a major interesting story that is coming also in the transformation of the modern authoritarian regimes. Because this is the big data authoritarianism that comes from China. In a certain way, this is about governing through big data, and in a certain way, moving population flows. So, on one level, this, funnily enough, this is a police state in the absence of the police informers, because everybody is going to inform on himself. So in a certain way, basically everybody is going to be followed by the state, and so on. And this is, in my view, this is quite interesting, because normally democracy is based on the fact that I know best what is best for me. I could be right or wrong, but this is also about my vote. And the whole feedback which the government gets is based on what an individual is going to make as his position in the way he's voting or doing. And then suddenly, with this big data, comes the government and said, we know better than you what you want, based on your previous choices, on your movements, on the risks, and so on. And this is a huge issue. I do believe that this is the central issue of the modern society. If the government believes that they know better than me what I'll do, and some of the big technology companies has absolutely the same claim. You know this famous story in the United States in which a 15-year girl, basically her parents went ballistic, and they went against Google because she started to receive this targeted advertisement for baby food and things like this. And then it appeared that she's pregnant. She didn't know that she's pregnant, but based on the big data and what she's consuming and what she's doing, the Google algorithm figured out that she's pregnant. It's kind of a story that if the government can figure out what I'll do or what I'm likely to do without asking me, this is the central attack on the very essence of a democratic society, that nobody can know better than me what I want.
So that's very, very interesting. But I would like to, I want to add one thing here. The typical Western understanding of the problem, in particular, the typical Western European understanding of the problem is, well, then it's you as an individual who needs to take care of this. And therefore, you need to be put into a position where you are in control of your data. And we are talking about personal information, therefore. And I think the longer I think about this, the more I have the feeling that this is a misconception, and that you can read this already in Foucault, and if you go back to Jeremy Bentham and all the others, which is the the government or the state or the player processing the big data is not really interested in you as a person. It's not about you, right? It's about the millions of people and the tracking of anybody, and it's no matter who you are, and therefore it's not really important whether we know who you are, provided that we know what you are doing. So it leads to a kind of fundamental issue of how fundamental rights have to be understood in a world where the individual is no longer treated as an individual personality.
But here I totally agree with you. And I do believe this is also the paradox about which probably we should talk much more in the future. On one level, the market is individualizing you as much as possible. It's trying basically to serve any kind of eccentricity that you have in your mind. And also you more and more are trying to define yourself as being different than others. On the other side, the government less and less is interested in this, because for the first time through the big data, the governments are really governing populations and not collection of individuals. And from this point of view, it's interesting because normally you're going to say that the governments are going to go against dissenters and people who are dissenting, and this is going to have ideological connotations. Now the governments go against deviations. They are not interested in the reason why you're not doing what others should do or what you're told to do. And I do believe you, in my view, are touching on the major problem modern democracy comes. Individual more and more had the feeling that he's more important, in a certain way, much more powerful, because the market is telling him, tell me what you want, I'm ready to serve you. And on the other side, basically the government is telling him, listen, I really don't care about you much. I'm caring about our society. I don't care what you're going to do or not to do. And this is what, in my view, also create this strange story of powerlessness, where people can have the feeling that in many respects we're freer than any before, but there is no direct connections between our political power as individuals, being voters or citizens, and our freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then again, it's getting much more important how long all this crisis will last, right? Because at the moment, one can still argue, well, this is a short transition period. We will go back to normal after we have finally found the vaccine. But the longer this period lasts, the more difficult it is to argue, well, this is just, an episode. It's getting more and more the new normal, interestingly. And I would really like, therefore, to learn from you what you think about the fact that governments seem to be, at least in my reading, very reluctant in telling the population that it might be the case that this is going to last longer than just for Christmas. So in the first phase we had, it will be over after Easter. It was Ruth Wodak talked about that yesterday. It was even a very Christian story that was told, so that we would have some kind of surviving Easter and coming back in a better world after Easter. Now it's surviving Christmas, and then everything will be, or surviving 4 weeks ahead of Christmas, and then everything will be in a completely new light. So the stories that are told are always cycles of 3, 4, 5 weeks, 2 months, 3 months. Nobody talks about that could last for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and it would be the new normal. Why is this? Is this because it's not in the perception of the politicians, or is it because it's too dangerous to talk about that, or too fearful? Or
any type of extra powers that you want, you're going to justify it as temporal. And this is true for any type of a war-related legislation or epidemics.
Yeah. And Orban was so interesting in this, right? Because Orban that's exactly what he did, and he even said, "Then I give this back now to the people, right? Because I no longer need it." So it's
in his case, it was even more interesting than this, because normally you try to basically retire the parliament in the moment of crisis, because you believe that the parliament can try to put pressure on you, keep you accountable, produce noise. In the case of Hungary, you have a parliament in which the government has a constitutional majority, and it's very disciplined one. So the major story, and I'll try to research this, was why suddenly, basically, Orban asked to retire the parliament for the moment of the extraordinary situation, when you have a parliament which is going to do anything you're going to ask him to do. Yeah. And this is the interesting story, and this is very much telling you something about the nature of the regime. What in a certain way, this was the outcome of my interviews and research. What was happening was that the opposition was quite ready to support extraordinary legislation because they were seeing this happening everywhere, and they understood that any government, should have more rights in the moment of crisis. But then for Orban, this consensus was perceived as a threat and not as an opportunity, because if you and the opposition are on the same position, then the political polarization on which the regime is based is starting to weaken. So then he came with a certain piece of legislation like this, which was totally unacceptable for the opposition. So he wanted the opposition to vote against, so he can make the famous statement that the opposition is the ally of the virus. So strangely enough, normally governments in a moment of crisis are looking for unity. But if your political legitimacy is based on a deep political polarization and trying to demonize the opposition as an enemy and not simply as an opponent, then for you, the unity is also a kind of a crisis for your own legitimacy. And this is why you have the Hungarian paradox in which you're trying to grab the power that you already have. And at the same time, you're returning the power, which you're returning nothing because you're keeping basically the same power at the same time.
Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, at least in the Austrian example, I don't want to compare Hungary with Austria here, obviously, but still, it's interesting perhaps to look a little bit into Austria. However, in Austria, the situation was that in the first wave in March and April, the government was very much supported also by the opposition. So there was some kind of, we solidarity, I would even call it, right? So everyone was very much in favor of setting responses very quickly. That is very different this time. This time, the government is now confronted with an opposition which voted against the measures that are taken at the moment. And one could read this now as a kind of going back to normal, meaning it's now more or less a typically normal political process where people say this and others say that. One could also say that this is just a transition to something which is going to come. And it will be very important to see what's going to come, because what we have at the moment is that the government sets the rules by regulations. Only the government is in charge of setting. So there is no parliament needed for this in many cases. And the parliament then being dominated obviously by a majority that covers the government or shares the government's perspective, is confronted with an opposition that is completely weak, right? They can't change anything. And this, it will be, in my view, very interesting to see how long this is going to last, right? Because if it's going to last for long, it will certainly weaken the opposition significantly, no matter what's going to happen and no matter what they're going to say, right?
No, you're making a very important point, because if you go back to March and April and even May, in most of the countries you have governments without oppositions. Yeah. And it was not simply that the parliaments were not there, but the opposition, either for a reason of political responsibility, felt obliged to stay where the government is, or basically they didn't know what to say. This started to change, I do believe, somewhere in the summer. And the funny story was that there is an epidemic, but there are elections too. Yeah. And from this point of view, you should try to position yourself as different. You should try basically to push the government to do this and that. It's quite interesting to see that, for example, it's not easy to understand what kind of a position certain type of political parties on the left or the right are going to adopt. It very much depends, are they in government or in opposition. For example, the Swedish Democrats, which are classical populist parties, and you expect them to do what, for example, Marine Le Pen is doing in France, to go against the restrictions. But in Sweden, because the government was much more a kind of a light touch approach, they insisting for strict for strict rules. So they're going to position and try to basically politicize any opposition on this. What was interesting for me, and I had this in a book on the pandemics, one of the reasons why extraordinary legislations and basically extra powers for the government, in my view, was less dangerous than many in the beginning feared, was that it happened in all the countries at the same time. So people start to compare. And from this point of view, Orban is a great example. If everybody else is starting to lift the extraordinary legislation, it is a huge risk that you decide to be the last one keeping it. All the time, people are trying to compare how much power governments are trying to get in Austria compared to the Czech Republic, compared to Germany, compared to Sweden. And this type of comparisons turn to be one of the major ways you're criticizing a government. You're going and saying, why are you taking this and that when in other countries, for example, these rights of the people have not been limited. And this is also, in my view, quite interesting for the European politics, because suddenly we discovered Europe as a common political space. All these comparisons between the EU member states, in my view, are much more intensive than they have been ever before.
Which is also positive, if one may see it. So it's a positive outcome of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Ivan, thank you. I think we covered quite some topics now, and there is so much food for thought in all this. So that I'm more than sure that I will come back to you with many questions, at least theoretically, in the upcoming weeks. But I would like to end this conversation today by asking you whether there is something that I should have asked you, something that is specifically important that you want to share with our audience, which is an audience that is very much driven by legal questions. So is there anything you want to tell lawyers how to deal with the situation in the next weeks and months?
Oh, I don't listen. The most interesting in any conversation is that you are answering the questions that you're telling. I never like people who basically go in a conversation believing that they have a message. Because this is good for the priests, but I don't believe it's good for the conversations. But I do believe this is interestingly about the legal dimensions of all this, because on one level, there are going to be these tensions between the national and the European legal space. Of course, now they're going to be much more intensive before, because when you're defining the existence of the extraordinary situation, normally this is the reasons for which the governments can ask for specific rights. For example, closing of the borders. This is legally. But when everybody is in an extraordinary situation, is it not time for the Brussels and for the European Union to try basically also to decide, is there a certain level in which we can talk about a European level of a state of emergency and what it means? So from this point of view, and this is, I do believe, a question that you have been asking much more than anybody else, but the Schmittian type of questions about the nature of the sovereignty, the sovereign is the one who basically decides on the state of emergency, have been very much pushed by this crisis, because also this is the crisis much more different than a classical war or terrorist attack. It goes, suddenly we are equally vulnerable. Suddenly it's about our personal health, and we are seeing it in a different way. And certainly, and I want to end up on this, when I was reading history books very much on pandemics, writing the book, there was one thing that struck me. And this was that while the pandemics have been incredibly important for transforming European societies, starting with the Black Death and then basically going to the Spanish flu, everybody remembers wars and revolutions. But we don't know how to remember pandemics.
Absolutely.
And I do believe for the lawyers, this is an interesting story, because you have, like in the planes, you have this kind of invisible planes, the famous, which the radar cannot get. I do believe now you can have this kind of a social, psychological positioning changes within society, which cannot be from time to time really captured by the legal radars, and you can end up in a totally different political and legal space without understanding where the change comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's so much work. I completely agree, and I really feel I really feel that. And I think there's so much that needs to be written also from a legal perspective on this. And this is a positive ending of this conversation. So I would like to keep it like this. Ivan, it was really a pleasure. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Also to our listeners and our audience and our viewers, have a good day. Stay healthy, stay safe, and stay connected with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Ciao.